Your Excellency, Professor Benedict Oramah, President and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Afrexim Bank, the African Export-Import Bank. Thank you so much for talking to Arise News. Good morning to you, sir. My first question to you, just coming off the Afrexim annual meetings and the milestone 30th anniversary celebrations in Accra, can you talk to us about the key takeaways from that gathering?
We're really very pleased that Arise was there in full force, along with many other African and international media houses. The 30th anniversary celebrations and of course the 30th annual meetings achieved a remarkable success. Enabled us to showcase what the bank had achieved in the past 30 years. By way of the key takeaways from there, we had a record number of attendees, about 5,000 from 90 countries. For us, that was a record. And more will have come in, but because of logistics difficulties. The event also enabled us to showcase a number of things. It enabled us to launch the Afrexim Bank Group. The Afrexim Bank Group, consisting of the Fund for Export Development in Africa, a multilateral fund based in Kigali, in Rwanda. Afrexim Sure, an insurance management entity that enables the bank to offer insurance services. Then we had other ring-fence initiatives. The PanAfrican Payment and Settlement System, which is the payment system that is being used to support the implementation of the AFCFTA, enabling payment for intra-African trade in African currencies. The Africa Customer Due Diligence Repository Platform, also called the MANSA, and of course other indirect subsidiaries of the bank, which are the subsidiaries of the fund, the Africa Medical Center of Excellence, the Africa Quality Assurance Center. So enabled us to launch these initiatives and the subsidiaries that will define what Afrexim Bank will look like in the coming years. As also was the first gathering of Global Africa. For the first time, the Caribbean countries that have become participating states of the bank through signature of partnership agreement attended the annual meetings and the 30th anniversary celebrations. We had 3 prime ministers from the Caribbean headlining the event. Prime Minister Davis of the Bahamas, who is the chairperson of the CARICOM, Prime Minister Maya Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and Grenadines. They came along with a broad spectrum of businesses and government agencies from the Caribbean, making it possible for us to begin to build that Africa that is our dream, that will extend, the Afro-Caribbean that will extend from Mauritius to the Bahamas. The event also enabled us to report on our financial performance. We were able to show a 36% growth in gross revenues to $1.5 billion, and 18% growth in net income to $450 million. Thanks to the strong support from our shareholders, by the time we were meeting in Accra, the shareholders' funds had risen to just under $6 billion. And when combined with the callable capital, we're now closer to about $10 billion. So it was a remarkable event for us, an event that made it possible for us to show what the bank had done in the past 30 years, and also provided a platform for us to have a lively debate of what will happen in the future. A lively debate supported by very, very prominent speakers from Africa, from the Caribbean, from the wider African diaspora, from the US, from Latin America, from Europe. We look ahead with confidence that we stepped out of that 30 years firmly on a march towards another 30 years of growth and support for our shareholders and participating states in Africa and the Caribbean.
Excellent stuff, very encouraging. So much to look forward to over the next 30 years. I want to touch on trade, and you mentioned amongst all the other milestones and items that were launched at the anniversary celebrations and the annual meetings, PAPS, the Pan-African Payment Settlement System. Can you speak about its importance and what it would mean for trade on the African continent?
You know, Africa today has about 42 currencies. There were about 42 fragmented payment systems. If you wanted to transact, you had to go from one currency to a third currency to the currency you are going to now be paying for the goods you wanted to buy. These have been costing the continent an estimated $5 billion a year for intra-regional payments. That had meant that payments sometimes took up to 14 days if they arrived. And in an age where foreign currency had increasingly become scarce, it also had caused a diversion of trade. Because to be able to trade, to buy something from your neighbor, you had to go and try and earn another currency somewhere else to be able to get the currency to pay for it. And we say this is not necessary. We want to domesticate all intra-African payments. We do not yet have a single currency, but we can domesticate the payments. Domesticate it by using a multilateral net settlement basis to reduce the foreign currency content of the trade. Make it easier for people to buy goods across borders. Return the trade that is diverted just because of currency issues. Reduce significantly the cost of making payments across Africa. Payment is what will drive intra-regional trade, because it is through payments that you do a transfer of value. So it's not an issue really of just the currency you use. It is also the infrastructure that integrates all the payment systems, that makes it easy for the farmer in Zambia to pay for Nollywood a movie he wants to stream in Nigeria using his or her phone, paying in Zambia kwacha. Making it easy for Ghana to contract an Egyptian contractor to build roads and bridges, paying in Ghanaian cedi. You are going to see a reduction in sovereign debt of many countries, and I mean in terms of foreign currency, because we will now start paying for those services, those infrastructure projects, which we spend about $60 billion a year on the continent in African currencies. And we complain today that airlines, we have difficulties in airlines flying all over Africa. But why would they fly when their monies are stuck in the countries because countries don't have foreign exchange to pay? But wait a minute. If, as we hope will happen very shortly, it is possible now for those airlines to get paid in the national currencies of their origin, that will reduce significantly this problem. And then make it possible for airlines to open more routes to other African countries. The stock exchanges are talking today about expanding and integrating trading. They have a linkage project that is being driven even by Nigeria and other countries. But you cannot do the linkage project, you cannot improve the liquidity we are talking about unless it is possible for a Kenyan to use Kenyan shilling to buy the shares in the Nigerian Stock Exchange. When that begins to happen, the volumes in our stock exchanges will begin to expand. Our businesses will begin to get make more issuances, make more money, and we'll then begin to see more and more integration of our economies. So the Pan-African payment and settlement system is key to the integration the AFCFTA seeks to achieve. Without it, I'm not saying we will not be able to do anything, but it will be harder, it will be peripheral. Payment is core because it's payment that enables us to transfer value. And we're happy, I'm very pleased to be working with the African Union, the AFCFTA Secretariat, to make sure that the payment system, which we have launched, commercially operating already, we make sure that it quickly ramps up all over Africa. Afrexim Bank is doing its bit. It fully funded the development of system. It operates it. It backs the settlement. Today, based on the pilot countries, $500 million for clearing and settlement fund, and increasing that to $3 billion as it goes continent-wide. And we believe that this will be the game changer Africa needs to more effectively become an integrated market. And this is the route to one day have a single currency.
You just preempted my next question, sir. The PAPS, Pan-African Payment Settlement System, is revolutionary. The investment community on the African continent, even outside Africa, have reiterated all the points that you have made about how much of a game changer it is going to be. But you did mention, the possibility in the future of a single African currency. You saw how long it took the Eurozone to get there. Obviously, it sounds like you're in support of it. How long do you think it will take, and do you think it will make things easier for the Afrexim Bank and trade in the future for the continent?
There is a path to a single currency. The African Union is already preparing the grounds, trying to make sure the institutional arrangements to make that happen exists. And one key element is the African Central Bank. It has, the signature of the treaty has been opened. A few countries have signed, I don't remember the number, but it doesn't yet have the requisite ratifications to come into force. But I'm a market person. I think PAPS is what will really accelerate it. Because as trading expands and deepens under PAPS, we'll begin to see dominant currencies emerge. Nobody woke up one day and said that dollar will be the global currency it is today. It's the realities of the market. So as that begins to emerge, then the discussion about the single currency will become easier. Today some people are emotional. Let's just call one currency, this is an African currency. But it's good to say that, but how will it thrive? Even with the new central bank, how would it work? The 55 countries, from very, very small to very, very large, arriving at convergence criteria that will required will be increasingly difficult if it is a managed process. Whereas with the Pan-African payment and settlement system, the market will throw up that currency. Even if you don't call it the African single currency, it will become de facto single currency. Maybe at that time, discussions can become easier to have. Around that currency, that actually has a central bank that will have everything. Then the central banks, the Association of African Central Banks, can then discuss around that fact and see whether that is the route to follow or whether there is a modification towards something that can be declared the African currency by fiat. So I believe perhaps is a route.
Thank you so much for that, sir. Well, you mentioned the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and of course, the Afrexim Bank partnering with the Secretariat to make that flow through. How important is this agreement, the AFCFTA, to trade in Africa in addition to your collaboration with them?
Well, the problem Africa has today is a problem traceable to its colonial history that divided the continent into 55 atomistic countries. And a colonial strategy that made it difficult for countries to deal with their neighbors and other African countries, but easier to deal with the metropolitan power, the colonial powers. And with colonial administration over, that continued. And when change came, it came in more trade with Asia, China and so on, rather than the trade amongst the countries. There are people who have said, oh, part of the problem is that we produce the same thing, and some have challenged this, the so-called fallacy of composition. But whatever it is, whatever theory says, whatever people analyze and come out with, the issue we have, if we want to, if we expect to grow faster, to industrialize, is that we must trade more amongst ourselves. And the trading more amongst ourselves means bringing down the 110 borders that divide us. Bringing down the 110 borders that divide us is finding ways to make sure we harmonize the rules of trade. So that if I move my goods from Nigeria to Benin Republic, I will not feel that I'm going to another country. So this, I will know, it will just be like trading, sending my goods from Lagos to Kano, for example. So, and that is what the AFCFTA aims to do. So the AFCFTA will provide a platform to grow regional value chains. In fact, the diversity of Africa, the huge continent of Africa, diverse in ecology, would then be leveraged for the benefit of the continent. So those parts of the continent that have the capacity to produce the goods we import today would then have the wider market to produce them. The other day I was speaking with Aliko Dangote on fertilizers. Yes, fertilizer today is actually a paradox we have. Some of the fertilizers Africa actually produces more than Africa consumes. Take urea, for example. But some countries in Southern and Eastern Africa depend today on the Black Sea in Russia and Ukraine to get grains, to get fertilizers. The same fertilizers are produced, say, in Nigeria, in Egypt, and exported elsewhere. So when we have more of the integration that AFCFTA will bring, we'll begin to reduce these anomalies. And when we begin to reduce these anomalies, we then create more capacity to produce. So the AFCFTA is the key to boosting regional integration and the industrialization. And in the new world we are getting into today, a new world that this multilateralism is weakening. We are beginning to see deglobalization. So in a deglobalized world, small atomistic economies would suffer. They cannot compete. So you need an Africa that brings everybody together so that it can earn a seat at the table to negotiate things that work best for the continent when they engage other bigger economies elsewhere. It is not a small economy, a small island economy that can go and negotiate with the Goliaths we have all over the place. So the AFCFTA has come at the right time with all the benefits I just mentioned and more. We also saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, because we were heavily involved in trying to find solutions. We were surprised, I was personally surprised to find that the continent as a whole had very little capacity to produce even face masks. Face masks, I'm not talking of anything that is complicated. So all these anomalies, I believe the AFCFTA begin to help us correct.
Very, very important there. I also want to ask you about your support for, and when I say your support, the Afrexim Bank support for a number of African nations. On the sidelines of the 30th anniversary celebrations, Afrexim Bank annual meetings, there was a $750 million facility signed for Ghana. Can you speak to the importance of what the bank has done on the continent in supporting these nations with credit facilities and so on?
Afrexim Bank was a child of necessity. It was born out of crisis, the debt crisis of the 1980s that brought Africa to its knees, that brought the first recession to the continent since independence. It was a response to that crisis. That crisis originated from Latin America, the so-called MBA countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. It was during that crisis the concept of country risk gained prominence. And many countries in the major money centers only banks with those major money centers cut credit lines to developing countries, especially Africa. So cutting those credit lines meant that, of course, Africa could not have access to facilities to import what it needed and even to support exports. So domestic absorption declined, GDP declined, and Africa went into recession. In response to that, trying to deal with that, made African ministers of finance meeting at the African Development Bank annual meeting in 1987 to ask the then president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, to look at the possibility of creating an African trade finance institution, an African Exim Bank. The thinking at that time was that such an institution would present a better financing risk than individual African countries, and therefore could be a vehicle for mobilizing international finance back into Africa. And because it will be endowed with preferred creditor status in its member countries across Africa, and staffed by those who understand Africa, it will be able to deliver these products safely and effectively, better than the usual international commercial banks. I just told you a story to tell you why we're doing what we're doing. Of course, they created such an institution and gave it the mandate to begin to address the root cause of the issues, the root cause of making sure we expanded the trade by diversifying away from commodities. Because all said and done, commodity shocks are always the source of the problem. Making sure it supported a diversification of markets from over-concentration in OECD markets. And of course also being a crisis response institution. What you've seen in recent years is that the world had now evolved into an environment of polycrisis. We go from one crisis to the other. One could hardly finish before another one just came in, will come in. That had then brought to the fore the work Afrexim Bank is doing. And because the bank is nimble, given that the way is the liquidity of its balance sheet, it's able to quickly run down assets from activities that are not critical to those that are critical when required. And they're supporting some of our government, supporting especially the banks, the central banks, to ensure that we do not go back to what happened in the 1980s, had always been our priority since this poly-crisis period. And one thing that takes countries to big crisis is when they begin to default in trade debt payments. Trade debt payment is the last thing you want to default on. And when the shocks come, either by way of the disease like the COVID crisis, in the way of commodity shocks, as we've seen, we saw in 2015, 2016, or by way of the Ukraine crisis, immediately the weakness of overdependence on commodities emerge. You have a backlog of letters of credit that have to be paid. Those backlog normally overwhelms the system. So unless you find a way to support the countries to enable them clear the backlog in an orderly manner, they will default. And because markets have long memories but short vision, once you default, it will take time for the markets to forget. Access to finance will be very difficult. Recovery becomes more difficult. So what Afrexim Bank does is to first go head on to tackle this issue of backlog. So we support commercial banks, support the central banks to make sure they pay the backlog of trade debt payments in an order, making it possible for them to be paid in an orderly manner. At the commodity crisis we saw in 2016, Afrexim Bank disbursed over $10 billion to many central banks, including in Nigeria, to enable to avoid what I just described. Over the period of the COVID up to the Ukraine crisis, we've done more than $25 billion, largely targeted at that, but also doing other innovative things that will help to complete projects that had the potential of generating exports. And the supporting also government that run into difficulties. For example, in Ghana, Ghana didn't have problems. I think there was a rating action that turned a liquidity crisis into a solvency crisis because Ghana bond prices were beginning to weaken, interest rates were rising. Ghana used to go to market to raise $3 billion every year. It became difficult to raise under those conditions. But then a rating action came. So the rating action came just like what happens when you are in market. The herd mentality took over. And what was a liquidity crisis put Ghana into a solvency crisis. But before they could reach an agreement with the IMF, Ghana needed to continue to thrive. And we had to step in to support them, making it possible for them to then have the breathing space to go through the IMF program.
Fantastic. Just a couple more questions for you, sir. Look, Nigerians are very proud about the prominent Nigerians that hold these positions around the world. A Nigerian is the president of the Afrexim Bank. A Nigerian is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. A Nigerian is the president of the African Development Bank. Inevitably, when we have these exclusive interviews, we're talking about Africa continental, but we tend to ask about domestic issues. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the reforms that we have seen in Nigeria recently with the new administration. Just on the economic side, just what your thoughts are.
Well, I like the word you use, reforms. Reform means that you want to reformulate something that was formulated before. Right. Anyway, I personally think that there was a need for the kind of reset that had happened since the new administration came in. And the reforms, I think all the political parties have followed the campaigns. They all said they would do the same, which meant that I believe the reform will receive or received broad acceptance. People all over the country understood that something had to change. The issue of subsidy I can talk about, the fuel subsidy, because Afrexim Bank is the main financier of the oil imports in the country. And in fact, we finance 70 to 80% of oil imports into Nigeria for several reasons. At a point, many financiers were withdrawing on the basis of the ongoing climate discussions, on the basis of perceived country risk, on the unsustainability of what was going on, and so on and so forth. So, Afrexim Bank became the major financier, as we also do with many other countries on the continent. The amount of money that we had committed to that was clear evidence that something had to happen. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen possible to continue. The year before we did, I believe we financed about $5 billion in imports. By May this year, we had done $4 billion because of oil prices. So you ask yourself, maybe if nothing happened, we have been talking about $10 billion. And most of these were going to as subsidies. And most of the imports, destined to Nigeria, they were. I was informed that people were actually selling petroleum products imported into Nigeria. In Sudan, as far away as Sudan, they trucked them to Sudan and still made a profit. That will tell you the story. So I believe that the subsidy removal was critical, was crucial, because otherwise Nigeria would have found itself in a very, very dire situation. And the money, can you imagine over the years spending $8 to $10 billion every year on this? Do you know how many railways we have built? So many other things, other investments we have made. So I think it was a bold move by the government of President Tinubu, and with a move, I believe everybody would find very, very needed, because if we didn't do it, I don't know, the country would be on its knees. And with regard to the foreign exchange market, there are several arguments, of course. There's, as usual in economics, there are those who favor controlling it and those who favor freeing it. Each group will have their own points. But the problem with multiple exchange rates is that it actually makes it difficult for funds to come in. It makes it difficult to manage risks, and so on and so forth. So having exchange rates merge and converge is important. The level at which they converge initially may be in a weakened exchange position, but over time, with good macroeconomic policies, it may well be possible that the rates could actually appreciate. If such an appreciation is the goal of government, because government may want to promote exports, they may promote policies that will depreciate the real exchange rate, and by way of to make it easier for exporters to operate profitably. But that's government policy. I think the important thing to ask yourself, whether is the merger. And that's where I will look at it, and not necessarily whether exchange rate was freed or not freed, making sure you do not have multiple exchange rates. And that is where I'll look at it. So if the freeing achieves that, then for me, that is the right thing to do. If there are other ways to achieve the same thing, yes, fine. But the way I look at it, markets are always the best means of achieving such an objective. There are also problems with it. Of course, the banks may have to recapitalize. The companies, they also have to recapitalize because, especially those who operate externally. But this is part of the adjustment process that will happen, and I believe the government that introduced the policies will also make sure that they support those adjustment processes so that it does not disrupt the economy. Even from the accounting point of view in the government, there will be things to be done, but it's not the first time. Nigeria is not the first country that has done this. So I'm pretty sure that the people that will be running the system would be able to manage it.
Fantastic. Final question for you, sir. During the anniversary celebrations, you released a report, the Outlook for Africa. What's your outlook for Africa? Are you cautiously optimistic? Are you very optimistic? It's a global world. There's fears of a global recession. What's your outlook for the continent just going forward?
Well, Africa is a price taker in many things. Africa is yet to become an integrated continent. So we still operate as more atomistic economies. So we take things as given and we adjust to it. So based on that, I would say cautiously optimistic. Why am I cautiously optimistic? If you asked me this question last week, I would tell you I was pessimistic. But a few things happened just 2 days ago, 3 days ago, that make me cautiously optimistic. Because the challenge the world faces is what we know globally. The crisis in Ukraine and its consequences, not only to Africa, but also the world. And there have been no indication of an end in sight. The effect it's having on the continent in terms of access to food, access to fertilizers, even access to petroleum products. That is a problem. And the fractures and the frictures it creates in what people do around the world. And then what seemed to be a rising tension between the West and China, that would, if we had been allowed to escalate, that would have been the worst thing that would have happened to the global economy and politics, by the way. So in the past few days, there appeared to have been a deliberate effort between China and the US to de-escalate this. And that's why I said cautiously optimistic. Maybe that could cool down so that the main issue remains the Ukraine crisis. And I will assume then that if that cools down, maybe these two powers, two economic powers, can put their head together to work out something that can lead to a resolution of the Ukraine crisis. And with the world, to move ahead, the world needs peace. That's key. If there's no peace, we will not achieve the optimal growth we need to achieve. The journey or the move towards deglobalization, I think, will continue. We just have to take it as given, and it is for several reasons: it's geopolitics, the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so on and so forth. Those will continue. So Africa, unfortunately, when it came to our turn to benefit from globalization, things began to move in a different direction. Asia benefited, lifted almost 1 billion people out of poverty. And everybody thought it was the turn of Africa, because China was already becoming a high-cost center for production. So we thought, in a new global era, Africa will industrialize, the global markets will offer itself to Africa, and because we have small open economies that are price takers in global markets, when you have the global economy that is buoyant, that is welcoming, is able to take your goods, then you have a chance of growing, you have a chance of pulling people out of poverty. I'm not saying that has disappeared completely, but certainly the ground is not as it was for China and the countries of Asia.
Your Excellency, Professor Benedict Oramah, the President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the African Export-Import Bank, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to Arise TV today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.